As Reverend Barbara lights the chalice, I invite you to rise, embody your spirit, and speak the words of our affirmation, which are printed on the back of the order of the service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do unite in worship.
Well, following our conversation about spiritual practice last Sunday, let's explore the second boilerplate sermon theme that I offered during transitioning ministry during this interim period. Today, let's talk about covenant. That is promises. Promises which are core to our participation in this liberal faith of Unitarian Universalism, as well as core to so many other corners of life, quite frankly. So for starters, I invite you to think on your understanding of covenant right now as you came into this room. See how I can complement or add to that understanding of covenant which you have come into the room with. For guests and newcomers, I hope this look at covenant today gives you a good idea of what Unitarian Universalism is all about. For you who consider yourself old-timers, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, I hope I offer some thoughts to expand your view of covenant. In talking about covenant, you'll also get to know me better, because I refer to covenant frequently, and I'll encourage each group or class or committee here to create a covenant this year, your own covenant. You can find a reading about how covenant is central to the free faith in our gray hymnal, number 591, the reading by James Luther Adams. You might want to look at it later on, or maybe even look at it now during the service. This is by James Luther Adams, who was a 20th century theologian and ethicist. He wrote this: I call that church free, which enters into covenant with the ultimate source of existence. He calls us to create covenants that we can live with in the face of death as well as life. So it's 591 in the back of the hymnal if anybody wants to consult now or later. Indeed, the concept of covenant is central to Unitarian Universalism, both as an approach to this denomination overall and to building compassionate relationships in any given congregation. So where did this stuff of covenant come from? Where did James Luther Adams get his ideas? He was an influential teacher of Unitarian Universalism in the second half of the 20th century. He influenced many ministers, and he didn't just make up this stuff of covenant, I promise you. He knew his free religious ancestors, the Pilgrims, who left Europe in search of religious freedom. The Pilgrims also knew their scripture and their religious ancestors, those prophets of ancient Israel, like Amos, who I read from, who urged the people to create covenants among themselves and covenants between themselves and their God. Among those ancestors was Amos, who I noted in the reading reminded his people about the importance of covenant. We actually sang about Amos's call to social justice and covenant building in the opening hymn, We'll Build a Land, which if you check in the hymnal, there's a reference there to where that text comes from. Amos called folks to justice building so that their nation might remain together as they build a land. You remember the prophets, don't you? Their job was to forecast and advise, to lay out a path going forward. I guess they were a bit like the modern pundits on TV shows, on news shows, without those shouting matches back and forth at one another. The prophet Amos, he called the nation of Israel to stand united so that their nation wouldn't be destroyed. Amos gave Israel several points of advice in the form of questions. I read only the one concerning covenants, so I'll repeat it. Amos asked his people, "Do two walk together except they be agreed?" Now, that wording might sound a bit archaic today. What Amos meant was, do two or more people need to agree? That is, do they need common beliefs in order to walk and work together and prosper as a nation? Many of us continue to ask this question today. How can humanity walk together? Now, persons of liberal mindset, politically, socially, religiously, are generally open to diversity, to walking with others of different beliefs and opinions, while persons of more conservative positions prefer to walk primarily with people who are like themselves. The liberal way says, I'll walk with you, even if I don't always agree with you. I invite introspection on your part. How do you, as a member of this liberal congregation, live up to this basic premise of walking with others, especially others you don't agree with? Amos knew walking together is relatively easy when we agree. You probably know that too. It's easy to walk and work with those who see eye to eye with you. What Amos calls us to is the ability to walk together when different members of a group see things differently. Amos knew that keeping covenants was hard work. Wouldn't we wish modern political leaders understood and lived by covenant? To be willing to walk across those ever-widening political aisles? Covenant lies deep in the heritage of liberal religion. Let's unpack some more about covenant. A covenant is a promise, a mutual agreement for how we live together. Our pilgrim ancestors were known as people of the promise, suggesting how central covenant was to them. Promise-making was what defined their free religion as well as Unitarian Universalism today. Promises create relationships. They don't define beliefs. Thus, it is our actions, how we live together, which are central. That which keeps this free faith together is deeds, not creeds. If you don't go away with anything else today, those three words, deeds, not creeds. Deeds, that is, actions that ask personal responsibility of us, not creeds. Words possibly imposed from some outside authority and quite possibly irrelevant to life here and now. That's what the Pilgrims wanted to get away from, those beliefs imposed from that higher authority. A covenant is not a contract, it's mutual promises which build relationships. And these promises are two-sided. We promise how we monitor our own actions, and we promise how we hold others accountable for their actions. And we often forget about that second side of covenant, the accountability. I'm going to devote a whole other sermon in the future to accountability. Deeds, not creeds. A fundamentally different approach from perhaps more orthodox methods of religion, which some of us may have grown up with. A creedless religion may be a hard concept to grasp, but my experience is that deeds build stronger connections than do creeds, because deeds or covenants ask personal commitments in our relationships with people and in activities that we work with from day to day. Deeds are much more tangible than our creeds. And yet a creedless religion does beg the question, So what holds it together? What is the glue? Why is Unitarian Universalism sometimes referred to as a religion that's like herding cats? Especially through tough times, how do we stay together without common scripture or common theology? Our wise pilgrim ancestors identified that glue very simply. You perhaps can guess what they said. Love held their covenant together. Love is the doctrine of this church, they said. Love for truth, love for one another. Love creates the power of covenant. These words should sound familiar to you. Aren't they part of this congregation's affirmation statement? Love is the doctrine of this church. So broadly said, the Pilgrims represent the Unitarian side of our heritage. Early Universalists were equally grounded in love. One of our Universalist founders, one of our grandfathers, Hosea Ballou, wrote, "If we agree in love, there's no disagreement that can do us any injury. But if we do not agree, no other agreements can do us any good." Today, our UU program's Side with Love is in full display. Anytime we wear our yellow t-shirts in solidarity for justice making, for example, or as the Durango community just looks at the east wall of Bowman Hall. When we side with love, we open ourselves and the world to transformation. Many of us know covenants outside church life. Some neighborhood associations are referred to as covenanted communities. I don't know, are covenanted communities in the Durango area? I don't know you all enough yet to know. Okay. Yeah. Covenants also exist in families or in schools or in workplaces. You might not call them that, but that's what they are. Promises that express deepest values. I often wonder if this idea of covenant were better understood. How might it reduce confrontation and confusion? Think about settings in your life where covenants would improve relationships. But let's get back to religious covenants. I hope the language of covenant is not unfamiliar to you, especially if you are a long-time Unitarian Universalist. While the habit of covenant has been around for centuries, however, for a long time we actually stopped using this vocabulary. And then about 20 years ago, one feisty UU minister, one of my colleagues, the Reverend Alice Blair Wesley, called us to remember the Pilgrims' commitment to covenant. She wrote, "The Pilgrims are our spiritual ancestors. We misunderstand our identity and miss out on great richness if we do not understand our derivation from their covenant." Reverend Alice reminded us that membership in the Pilgrim Church was voluntary, not imposed by the state. And so the early settlers knew that free spirit needs room to blow where it may, a phrase that James Luther Adams also used. Our ancestors explained covenant in an important document called the Cambridge Platform, which was adopted in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1648. That document still stands as the foundation of the free church. Covenants are based on common values. A mindset of covenant is especially important for congregations during times of change, such as interim ministry, because it helps congregations define their agreed-upon values and how to call one another to accountability to uphold those values. Covenants are like internal compasses, demonstrated by outward actions. Covenants are realized in all we do, how we involve children in the life of the community, how we take social justice into the civic arena, how we observe boundaries between professional staff and membership, how we trust one another and forgive one another when we fall short on promises. So covenant, as I've discussed it thus far, has been primarily referring to explicit covenant, explicit in concept. That is, promises we intentionally create and practice. However, friends, we also need to be mindful of implicit covenants, values which evolve, perhaps without even our being aware of them, which lurk in systems and can influence relationships. It's important to keep alert to implicit covenants, especially if they have negative implications. For example, covenants that resist change, or covenants that prompt us to interact mostly with others who are like us, even while we say we promote diversity. The phrase, "Oh, we've always done it like that," is a signal to interim ministers that there may be some implicit covenant lurking in a system. So during this ministry, I promise you, I covenant with you, I will point out implicit covenants that you may not suspect are lurking about among you. Any group can create a covenant statement. An entire congregation, professional staff, an adult education class, a soul matters group. Covenants have different purposes and different styles. They may express ways of operating together, and I know you have many behavioral covenants in this congregation. A covenant statement such as, "To the best of my ability, I will come to this meeting having read the reports sent out ahead of time." That's a promise for your behavior. Or a covenant just at the start of a congregational meeting can help the meeting run smoothly, a very short statement about how you're going to be together during a meeting. A third style of covenant that I want to promote is expressed in fairly short, easily remembered statements which express basic values, such as, "I assume the best intentions on the part of each person in this group." During reflection time after social hour, and we will have reflection this morning after social, I can explain more about this third mode of covenant, which I want to encourage each group in this congregation to consider writing. I want this new mode of covenant will complement the many covenant statements that already exist in this room. And please also, during reflection time, members of the transition team will also be talking more about this transitioning period. Let me offer a few tips for creating a covenant, and I'll come and help any of your groups writing covenant statements. There are 4 necessary qualities for a covenant. First, it's written by the person or persons under that covenant. It's not delivered by some outside authority. A minister doesn't write the covenant for your group. You write the covenant. Second, the covenant is easily available and easily repeated. Not so many words that you can't remember them. Third, a covenant should be reviewed often to keep its relevance alive. And fourth, in reviewing, a covenant is always open to change. I do hope we all review covenant statements more often than a certain Midwestern farmer did in the type of covenant he knew best, the marriage covenant. The farmer's wife complained to him that he never said, "I love you," to her. "Don't worry," he said. "I told you when I married you 30 years ago that I love you. If I ever change my mind, I'll let you know." I call this congregation to review your covenants more frequently than every 30 years. I hope this interim year will be grounded in covenant. I encourage groups and teams to write new covenants or review existing covenants. There's many methods for doing this. There's no one right way. It's time well spent. And there's a wealth of resources about covenant on the Unitarian Universalist website. And I'm available also to help you. I hope I've made my point, friends. Covenants help create compassionate, respectful relationships, personal, family, religious, even political. I know that the stuff of living in covenant can be challenging. Any covenant requires trust that our walking partners know where they're going and that they reciprocate trust to stay on the path with us, especially if we see the path differently than they do. Even if our paths diverge, covenant's accountability invites us to come back together. We don't all have to think alike to love alike. I know how risky it can feel, this walking together, especially when we don't agree. Yet in that space of risk lies the basic religious experience of transformation. Think about any risks you've taken in your life and how they changed you. In that space of risk, we find the holy. We find grace. We find the capacity to reach more and more deeply into this experience called life. We Unitarian Universalists have at least 400 years of covenant in our heritage. Because covenants are renewable, our communities are also. Doesn't this feel so hopeful? Covenants give us the capacity to emerge from brokenness and know grace. And through grace, we restore beloved community. Many of you know this well. You have continued to walk together, even through tough times, even when you were walking on the path with someone who had different views than you. Our trust for one another, rooted in love, keeps our covenants strong. Strong covenants bode well for the future of liberal faith. Trust helps us move closer to beloved community, right here, right now, in this congregation, in this country that so desperately seeks connection, community, grace, and forgiveness. Keeping covenants strong is a holy act. Love will guide us. It always has, my friends. My friends, may we all walk well together during this interim ministry. May all this be so.